She was still breathing. That was the only thing Caleb Marsh could confirm when he pulled back the wagon canvas and found her. Wrists bound with rope so tight the skin beneath had gone black. A paper pinned above her heart with 2 words written in a stranger's hand. Paid. Delivered. His name was at the bottom. His money. His signature. Forged clean. She opened her eyes, looked straight at him, and said the words that would change everything. You purchased me. So do whatever you came to do. I won't fight anymore. Caleb had never wanted to burn a man's world to the ground more than he did in that moment. If you want to know how one woman's broken whisper became the match that lit a fire no railroad baron could extinguish, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe to this channel, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon had no business being there. Caleb Marsh noticed it the way a man notices anything that doesn't belong. Not all at once, but in pieces. First the shape against the pale morning sky, sitting wrong at the edge of his eastern fence line. Then the horse in the traces, standing with its head dropped so low the bridle nearly touched the dirt. Then the silence. No driver, no sound. Nothing moving except the canvas cover lifting and dropping in the hot New Mexico wind like something trying to breathe. He'd been up since before dawn. He was always up before dawn these days, because sleep had stopped being a reliable thing 3 years ago. Around the same time, he'd handed in his deputy's badge and walked away from everything he'd once believed about the law. He'd come out to check the north fence where something had knocked a post loose in the night. And now he stood with his coffee going cold and stared at the wagon and felt the particular unease of a man who has seen enough trouble to recognize its shape from a distance. He set the cup on the porch rail and walked to the corral. His bay gelding, Cord, stood waiting in the early heat, ears forward, already reading something in the air that Caleb couldn't name yet. He swung up without saddling and let the horse carry him across the hard-packed ground toward the fence line, his hand resting easy on his thigh, near but not touching the colt at his hip. The closer he got, the worse it felt. The horse in the traces was in bad shape, ribs showing through a dull, sweat-matted coat, flies gathering at the corners of its eyes. It didn't flinch when Caleb rode up alongside, just turned its head and looked at him with the dull patience of an animal that has learned not to expect anything good from people. Easy, Caleb said, though he wasn't talking to the horse. He dismounted and stood at the back of the wagon. The canvas hung in a torn flap, and from underneath it came a smell that hit him somewhere deep and old. The smell of human suffering, of days without water, of fear soaked into skin and clothing until it became something permanent. He pulled the canvas back. For 3 full seconds, his mind refused to process what his eyes were telling him. A woman lay curled on the wagon bed, her wrists bound in front of her with rope knotted tight enough that the skin had bled and dried and bled again. Her dress, dark brown, plain frontier cloth, was so destroyed by dirt and worse that it barely registered as clothing anymore. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever pins had held it and lay tangled across her face. Even unconscious, her features were braced against something, her jaw, her shoulders, her whole body drawn in on itself like she was still waiting for a blow that hadn't landed yet. A piece of paper was pinned above her heart. Caleb pulled it free with fingers that weren't entirely steady. Paid. Delivered. C. Marsh, Cobra Wells. His own name. His own town. Written in a hand he had never seen before. He read it twice. Then he crouched down and pulled his knife from his belt and began to work at the ropes on her wrists, careful, trying not to drag the blade across the wounds already there. The knots were professional. Someone who did this regularly, who knew the difference between a knot that holds and a knot that merely looks like it holds. The rope fell away. She woke up. Not gradually, not the way people surface from ordinary sleep. She woke the way an animal wakes when something touches it in the dark. All at once, her whole body pulling backward, her breath coming sharp and ragged, her eyes open and scanning and already calculating. Gray eyes, the color of overcast sky, and in them, no hope whatsoever. Just the flat, terrible patience of someone who has already decided what happens next. She looked at Caleb. She looked at the knife in his hand. She looked at the cut rope lying on the wagon bed. Then she looked back at him, and something shifted in her expression. Not relief, nothing as warm as that. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of a person who has learned to read men quickly because her life has depended on that reading. "You purchased me," she said. Her voice was raw from thirst, but it was level, controlled. The voice of a woman who had decided that control was the last thing she owned. "So do whatever you came to do. I won't fight anymore." The words landed on Caleb like a fist to the chest. He rocked back on his heels. His hand tightened on the knife handle, then deliberately loosened. He set the knife down on the wagon bed where she could see it, where she could reach it if she needed to. And he looked at her and tried to find words that could possibly matter against what she had just said. "Ma'am," he said, "I didn't purchase anything." She didn't blink. "Your name is on the paper." "I know. That's not my signature." "The man who brought me here said your name, said I'd been paid for, said I was delivered." "What man?" Caleb leaned forward slightly. "What did he look like?" But she was already drifting, her eyes losing focus. The effort of speaking had cost something she didn't have left to spend. He caught her before she could fall back against the hard boards, and held her up with one arm while he thought through what he needed to do in the next 10 minutes. Water, wounds, cover, then answers. He got her to the house on cord, riding slow, one arm around her waist, talking low and even the whole way. Not because he thought she could hear him, but because the talking seemed like the right thing to do. "You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you. I've got you. You're going to be all right." Words he wasn't entirely sure were true, but words that at least pointed in the direction of something true. He laid her on the bed in the spare room and went for water. When he came back, she was watching him. Her eyes tracked him from the doorway to the bedside with the careful attention of a woman mapping exits. He set the pitcher down, poured water into the cup, and held it out toward her without moving any closer. "Can you take it yourself?" he asked. "Or do you need a hand?" She reached for the cup. Her arms shook with the effort, but she took it and drank without help. And he noticed that she kept her eyes on him the whole time, above the rim of the cup, not blinking. When it was empty, she set it down on the mattress beside her. "Why?" she said. "Why bring me inside?" "Because you needed water and shade, and your wrists tended. Men don't do things for no reason." "No," Caleb said, "they don't. My reason is that someone left you at my fence, with my name on a piece of paper. And that means whatever this is, it's already my problem, whether I want it to be or not. So I'd rather understand it than pretend I didn't find you." She stared at him. "That's it?" "That's it." "No other reason?" "Not one." She was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her working through it, testing the logic of it, looking for the angle she'd been taught to expect. "I don't believe you," she said finally. "I know. You don't have to. Can I see your wrists?" A pause. Then she held them out. He worked slowly, cleaning the rope wounds with water and the carbolic acid he kept in the cabinet. wrapping them in clean linen. She didn't make a sound, though he could see by the way her jaw set and her breath controlled itself that it hurt considerably. He kept his movements deliberate and small, nothing sudden, nothing that would require her to decide quickly. "Your name," he said while he worked. "Ruth," she said. "Ruth Calloway." "Where did they take you from, Ruth?" "The Albuquerque depot." Her voice went flat and careful, like she was reciting something rather than remembering it. "I had a position in Denver. Telegraph operator for the Western Union office on Larimer Street. I'd been hired by correspondence. 3 months of letters back and forth. References checked. Contract signed. I arrived at the Albuquerque station to change trains, and 2 men were there holding a card with my name on it. They said there'd been a change of plans, that my new employer wanted me to meet with a placement representative first." "The Western Placement Bureau," Caleb said. Ruth went very still. "You've heard of it." He tied off the bandage on her left wrist and moved to her right. "I've heard the name, in connection with a man named Jerome Vance." "He's the one." Her voice didn't change, flat and controlled and terrible in its steadiness. "I never saw him, but the men who took me used that name. Said I'd been placed with a rancher outside Cobra Wells. Said it was a domestic position, cooking, housekeeping, legal and respectable." She paused. "The paper on my dress didn't say anything about cooking or housekeeping." "No," Caleb said. "It didn't." "How much?" He looked up at her. "The price," she said, "on the paper. How much did they charge for me?" "Ruth, tell me." $400. She closed her eyes, one breath in, one breath out. Then she opened them again, and they were exactly as level as before. And whatever she'd done with that information in the space between closing her eyes and opening them again, she'd done it alone, in private. And she was done with it. "That's more than 6 months of a telegraph operator's salary," she said. "I suppose that tells you something about what they expected in return." Caleb set down the bandage roll and looked at her directly. "Nobody in this house expects anything in return. Not one thing. You're going to eat something and rest. And then when you're ready, you're going to tell me everything you remember. After that, we figure out what comes next." "There isn't anything that comes next," Ruth said. "Men like Vance don't let their inventory walk away." The word inventory hit something in Caleb's chest that had been calcifying for 3 years, since the day a judge in Santa Fe ruled in favor of a railroad land claim against 40 families, and Agnes Corbin had stood up in that courtroom and said she would not accept it. And 6 weeks later, Agnes Corbin was dead, and the railroad had its land, and the judge was still on the bench. "No," he said, "they don't." He stood up, gathered his supplies. "You can bar the door from the inside. There's food in the kitchen whenever you want it. I'm going into Cobra Wells." "To do what?" "To find out how a man I've never met put my name on a bill of sale." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Be careful. If Vance has connections in this territory—" "He does." Caleb moved to the door. "That's why I'm going to start with someone I know before I go anywhere near anyone I don't." "Mr. Marsh." He turned back. Ruth Calloway was sitting upright on the edge of the bed, her bandaged wrists resting on her knees, her gray eyes fixed on him with an expression that was not trust. She was nowhere near trust, but something that was at least not entirely its opposite. Something cautious and watchful and raw. "I was a telegraph operator," she said. "I know Morse code. I know how to use a wire. If there's anything that skill is worth to you in whatever you're planning, I want it used. I don't want to sit in a room and wait while someone else fights my battle." "Noted," Caleb said. And he meant it. Dot Crane had run the Mineral House Hotel for 21 years, And she knew two things about men who came through her door in a hurry. They were either running from something or running toward something, and the smart money was usually on both at once. She looked at Caleb Marsh the moment he walked in and read him correctly inside of 5 seconds. "Coffee's hot," she said. "Talk while I pour." He talked. Dot listened with her arms folded and her expression doing nothing that would betray what she was thinking, which was considerable. When he finished, she set his cup down and said, "The Western Placement Bureau." "You know it." "I know enough." She pulled out a stool from behind the counter and sat down heavily, like the conversation had weight she needed to redistribute. "I've had 8 women come through this hotel in the past 2 years. Traveling through, they said. Meeting an employer, they said. Always a man with them who did all the talking. Always gone by morning." "Gone where?" "I don't know. I never knew." Her jaw tightened. "I told myself it was domestic placement. I told myself they were going to respectable positions. I told myself it wasn't my business." She looked at Caleb, and her eyes were direct and unsparing. "I was wrong to tell myself all of that." "Dot, who in this town is connected to Vance's railroad interests?" A pause. A long one. "Wade Pickett," she said finally, and the name cost her something. He could see it. "The sheriff. 7 years ago, his boy was sick. Fever that wouldn't break. He borrowed money he couldn't repay from a man who works for Vance's operation. He's been repaying it differently ever since." She picked up her coffee cup and set it down without drinking. "Wade's not a bad man, Caleb. He's a trapped one. There's a difference, though I understand if you don't currently have patience for that distinction." "What do I need to know about Vance himself?" "He comes through 4-5 times a year. Stays here, actually. Always the corner room on the 2nd floor. Always pays in cash. Always has dinner with Judge Alderman and at least 2 men from the Territorial Land Office. Charming as a Sunday sermon." She paused. "He has a wife in Denver. 2 daughters in a Boston school. He talks about them like a man who loves his family." Caleb absorbed this. "He's due back." 3 weeks, maybe 4. He runs to a schedule. Then I have 3 weeks. Dot leaned across the counter and dropped her voice to something that wasn't quite a whisper, but was pointed enough to function as one. "Caleb, whatever you're planning, if you go at Vance directly, without evidence, you'll vanish. Same as anyone else who's tried. He doesn't need to have you killed. He just needs to make a few telephone calls to the right offices in Santa Fe, and you'll find your land title disputed, your cattle impounded, and your credit gone. He does it through channels. That's the whole trick of him." She held his gaze. "You need something that channels can't make disappear." "I know." "The woman who was left at your place." "Her name is Ruth." "Ruth." Dot nodded slowly. "Is she willing to talk?" "She's willing to do considerably more than talk." Caleb stood up. "Don't mention any of this to anyone." "Caleb, I've been not mentioning things in this town for 20 years. She picked up his empty cup. "Go home. Take care of her. And when you're ready to do something about this, you come back to me before you go anywhere else. I've been watching Vance's operation work for 2 years, and I haven't been entirely idle." He stopped with his hand on the door. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dot said, setting the cup in the basin with the careful deliberateness of a woman who chooses every word, "that I'm not the only one who noticed something was wrong with those women passing through. And some of us have been writing things down." He rode back to the ranch with the heat of the afternoon pressing down on him, and his mind running through what Dot had told him about Wade Pickett, and what that meant for any attempt to use local law, and what Dot had implied about her own records, and what Ruth Calloway had said about wanting her skills used rather than being left to wait in a room. He found Ruth in the kitchen. She had moved from the spare room on her own and was sitting at the table with a glass of water, and a stillness about her that wasn't peace. It was more like a held breath, a coiled quality. The stillness of someone who is thinking very hard and very fast and doesn't want to show it. She looked up when he came through the door, and she didn't ask him how it went. She waited. He respected that. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Jerome Vance," he said, "runs an outfit called the Western Placement Bureau out of Santa Fe. Railroad man officially. Land acquisition, right-of-way contracts, territorial influence. The Placement Bureau runs underneath the railroad work like a shadow. Women answering advertisements for domestic positions, teaching posts, telegraph work. All legitimate on paper. All fraudulent in practice." "He sold me," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "He sold you to a buyer he believed was me, using a name and a financial connection that he'd manufactured through the general store records." "How?" "I have an account at Morrison's store. I buy feed and fence supplies on credit, settle up quarterly. Someone added a line to the ledger, a special order, prepaid, delivery to the Marsh property. The money came out of my deposit. $400 drawn against my account 3 weeks ago by someone with a forged signature." He paused. It was close enough that Ed Morrison's clerk passed it without question. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why your name?" "I don't know yet. That question bothers me more than anything else. Vance knows this territory. He has contacts in the land office, the judiciary, the sheriff's department. If he wanted a reliable buyer in Cobra Wells, there were easier choices than a former deputy marshal who lives alone on a cattle operation and rarely comes to town." He leaned forward, both forearms on the table. "He used my name specifically. I want to know why." "Because you're isolated," Ruth said. "Because you live alone, and you don't have relationships in town that would give anyone reason to believe you if you tried to raise an alarm. Because a former lawman who resigned under circumstances nobody fully understands is the last person the territorial judge would take seriously against a respected railroad contractor." She held his gaze steadily. "He chose you because he thought you were the kind of man no one would listen to." The accuracy of it was like cold water. "That's right," Caleb said quietly. "He was wrong about one thing." Ruth's jaw set. "He didn't know about me." "No, he didn't." "What's the next step?" Caleb looked at the woman across from him. Her bandaged wrists, her destroyed dress, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of days without real sleep, and underneath all of it, that quality he'd noticed from the first moment, the one that Vance's men had tried to extinguish and hadn't managed to reach. She had a precise analytical mind. She had a skill that mattered. She had a fury that was banked down to something controlled and cold and far more useful than anything hot. "Dot Crane, at the Mineral House," he said. "She's been watching Vance's operation for 2 years without knowing what to call it. She's been keeping records, and she says she's not the only one." "Then we start there." "I need to tell you something first." He kept his voice level. "If Vance learns that you're here, that you're talking, that you didn't arrive at your intended destination in the condition he expected, he'll send men. He won't come himself. He never comes himself. But he'll send the kind of men who know how to make a situation resolve quietly." Ruth didn't flinch. "I understand." "Do you understand what I mean by quietly?" "Mr. Marsh," her voice was dry as the New Mexico hardpan outside, "I was kidnapped at a train station in broad daylight by men who counted on the fact that no one would interfere on behalf of a woman traveling alone. I understand exactly what you mean." A silence settled between them, and for the first time, it wasn't entirely uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had each, in their own separate way, already decided to walk toward the danger rather than away from it. "You're going to need something more than my hospitality to be safe here," Caleb said. He'd been turning this over the whole ride home. "Vance has a legal document, a sale, a contract, however fraudulent, that puts a claim on you. His lawyers can make that claim complicate things considerably, even if it's never upheld in a legitimate court. The most effective way to invalidate that claim immediately is a competing legal claim." Ruth looked at him carefully. "What kind of competing legal claim?" He said it directly, because she was not a woman who would appreciate any other approach. "Marriage." The silence stretched out. "You're suggesting I marry you," Ruth said, each word measured and precise. "I'm suggesting that a married woman cannot be claimed under the kind of contract Vance is holding. It would void his document, give you legal standing that his money and his lawyers can't easily argue around." He kept his eyes on hers. "I'm not asking for anything from you. Not now, not later. I'm offering you a legal shield. Nothing more, nothing less." Ruth studied him for a long time. "We have spoken for approximately 4 hours," she said. "I know. I have no reason whatsoever to trust you." "I know that too." "Then explain to me," she said slowly, "why a man who has never met me would offer me his name." "Because 3 years ago," Caleb said, "I watched a woman named Agnes Corbin stand up in a federal courtroom with enough evidence to bring down a railroad land scheme, and I believed the law would protect her, because the law was supposed to work that way. And I was wrong. And she's dead. And I handed in my badge the day they closed the investigation." He looked down at his hands. "I have spent 3 years on this ranch telling myself that what happened to Agnes wasn't my fault, because I followed procedure. I followed every procedure there was." He looked back up. "I am not following procedure again. Not when there's something better I can do." Ruth said nothing for a long time. Outside the window, the light was going golden and thin, the way it did in the late afternoon when the heat had burned off the day's edge and left something quieter behind. "I need to think," she said finally. "Take whatever time you need." "If I agree," she stopped, started again. "If I agree, I want it understood. This is a legal arrangement and nothing further unless I decide otherwise. I decide, not you. Understood completely. And if I want to leave when this is over, then you leave, with whatever you need to go. No argument from me." She looked at him for one more long moment. Whatever she was reading in his face, she read it carefully, and she read it all the way through. "I'll give you my answer in the morning," she said. Caleb nodded and stood. "There's a room at the end of the hall. The lock works. Take it." He moved toward the door. "Ruth." She looked at him. "Whatever you decide," he said, "I'm going to find a way to bring Vance down, with or without the marriage. That part isn't a negotiation." Something moved through her gray eyes. Not warmth yet, not trust, but something that acknowledged him as a real person making a real promise, which was more than she had been offered in a long time. "Good night, Mr. Marsh," she said. "Good night, Ruth." He sat on the porch that night with his rifle across his knees and watched the desert go dark under the stars, and thought about Agnes Corbin and Jerome Vance, and a document with a forged signature that had put his name on a human being. Somewhere out in Cowboy Wells, Wade Pickett was sitting in a sheriff's office with 7 years of compromised choices sitting on his chest like stone. Somewhere in Santa Fe, Jerome Vance was looking at a ledger that said his delivery had been made. And inside the house behind him, a woman who had been shipped across the territory like freight was deciding whether there was a single human being left in the world worth trusting with the one thing they hadn't managed to take from her: her own judgment. Caleb kept watch. The stars wheeled. The desert breathed. And at some point, before dawn, he heard the bolt slide home on the door at the end of the hall. And he understood that Ruth Calloway was still deciding, and that the decision she made in the morning would set the shape of everything that came next. She gave him her answer before sunrise. Caleb heard her moving in the kitchen before the sky had fully decided what color it wanted to be. And when he came in from the porch, she was standing at the stove with a fire going under the coffee pot, and her back straight, and her bandaged wrists visible below her cuffs, and her gray eyes already decided. "Yes," she said, before he could speak. "I'll marry you, on the terms we discussed." "All right." "I want it done today, before Vance's people realize something went wrong with the delivery." "Reverend Aldous at the First Methodist on Cobra Wells Main Street. He's not connected to Vance as far as I know." "As far as you know," Ruth said. "As far as I know," Caleb repeated, because she deserved honesty more than she deserved reassurance. Dot Crane would have heard if he were. She hears most things. Ruth poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table for him without being asked. It was a small thing. He noticed it anyway. "Tell me about Dot Crane," she said. "Tell me exactly what she said about the records she's been keeping." He told her while they drank the coffee. All of it, including the part about Wade Pickett and the borrowed money and the 7 years of deliberate incuriosity. Ruth listened the way she seemed to do everything, completely, without interrupting, with her eyes on the middle distance and her mind clearly working several steps ahead of whatever he was saying. When he finished, she said, "The sheriff is the weak point. He's also the dangerous point. If Vance learns we're building a case and he leans on Pickett, then Pickett tells him everything he knows, which at this moment is nothing, because we haven't told him anything." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "We need to know which way Pickett breaks before we decide whether he's an obstacle or an asset." Caleb looked at her across the table. 3 days ago, she had been unconscious in a wagon. This morning, she was running tactical analysis over coffee. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," Ruth said, and there was something in it that might have been dry humor if it hadn't been delivered so flatly. "That's why Vance's men didn't particularly enjoy the week they spent transporting me. I kept asking questions they didn't want to answer." "What kind of questions?" "Operational ones. How many women passed through the Bureau annually? What the routing looked like? Which territories had the highest density of buyers?" She set her cup down. "I was gathering information while they thought I'd given up. People tell you things when they think you're broken." The weight of that settled on Caleb like something physical. "Ruth." "Don't," she said, not unkindly, just firmly. "I don't need sympathy for what I did to survive. I need you to understand that I am not simply a witness. I have information inside my head that is worth considerably more than a signed statement about what happened to me personally. I know the shape of Vance's operation from the inside. The routes, the timing, the language they used among themselves." Her eyes met his directly. "That is what we are going to use." They rode into Cobra Wells an hour later, side by side, and Caleb watched the town read them as they came down the main street. He saw the moment in each face, the recognition of him, the inventory of her, the calculation of what that combination meant. Cobra Wells was small enough that a rancher bringing a woman to town before breakfast was a fact that would be processed and discussed and theorized about before noon. He didn't care. That was, in a certain sense, the point. Reverend Aldous was a small man with enormous eyebrows and the permanent expression of someone who had heard every variety of human complication and had learned not to let any of it alter his fundamental commitment to proceeding. He looked at Caleb and Ruth, standing in the doorway of his church at 7 in the morning, and said only, "Come in, then." The ceremony took 11 minutes. Dot Crane served as witness, having appeared at the church door approximately 90 seconds after they arrived, which told Caleb that Dot had eyes on the main street at all hours and had simply materialized when the situation called for it. She stood beside Ruth with her arms folded and her face expressing nothing except a solid, implacable endorsement of the proceedings. When it was done, Reverend Aldous signed the certificate and handed it to Caleb and said, "I won't ask questions I can see you won't answer, but I'll pray for both of you." He paused. "And I'll pray rather specifically for whatever trouble is behind those eyes, young lady, that it resolves in your favor." Ruth looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Reverend," she said. "That's the first genuinely kind thing anyone has said to me in several weeks." They left the church and stood on the steps in the morning heat, the three of them, and Dot looked at the certificate in Caleb's hand and said, "Good. Now come to the hotel. There are things I need to show you, and things you need to hear, and I'd rather do it somewhere I can control the exits." Dot's office at the back of the mineral house was a small room that smelled of ledger paper and strong tea, and something else underneath that Caleb eventually identified as the particular smell of a place where serious thinking had been done over a long period of time. There was a desk buried in papers, and a cabinet against one wall, and a window overlooking the alley that had the advantage of showing anyone approaching from behind. Dot locked the door. Then she opened the cabinet and took out a box, a plain wooden box, the kind used for storing receipts or invoices, and set it on the desk between them and lifted the lid. Inside were papers, dozens of them, hotel registers with names circled in pencil, dates, descriptions written in Dot's small, precise hand, copies of pages from a ledger that Caleb recognized as the format used by Morrison's General Store. 2 letters, unopened, with a Santa Fe return address. 8 women through this hotel in 2 years, Dot said. I wrote down every name they gave, which were almost certainly not their real names. I wrote down the descriptions of the men with them. I wrote down dates and times and the direction they left in. She pointed to the ledger pages. Ed Morrison's clerk is my nephew. He doesn't know what he copied or why I asked him to. But he made these for me 6 months ago when I started to think something wasn't right with certain entries. Ruth leaned forward and picked up one of the ledger pages. Her eyes moved across it quickly, the eyes of someone trained to read dense columns of information. These are purchase records, she said. Special orders, prepaid deliveries. She looked up. The same format as the entry for Caleb. Yes, Dot said. 7 entries over 14 months. Different names, different destinations. She paused. Same handwriting on the special order lines. Different from the clerk's. Someone with access to the ledger who wasn't the clerk, Caleb said. Vance's man in Cowboy Wells, Ruth said. She set the paper down. He has someone local who's been adding these lines. Someone with regular access to Morrison's store. Ed's clerk wouldn't have noticed a familiar face, Dot said. He trusts people he recognizes. It's a quality that served him poorly in this situation. Who has that kind of regular access? Caleb said. Dot looked at him steadily. 3 people. Ed himself, which I will not believe. His delivery manager, a man named Cook, who's been with him 12 years. And one other. She stopped. Dot? Wade Pickett does Ed's quarterly account review, Dot said. Has done it for years. Helps Ed keep his books balanced, he says. Civic service. Her jaw tightened. He would have had access to that ledger 4 times a year for 7 years. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. He might not have known what he was facilitating, Ruth said carefully. A man who reviews accounts might have passed along store access to someone without understanding the purpose. Or he knew exactly, Caleb said. Either way, Ruth said, we can't approach him directly until we know which it is. If he's conscious of his role, and he's still protecting Vance, any approach from us sends a warning to Santa Fe inside of 24 hours. She looked at Dot. You said you weren't the only one who noticed something wrong. Who else? Dot reached into the box and produced a folded paper. She opened it and spread it on the desk. It was a list, 15 names, each with a notation beside it. Caleb leaned over and read the first few. A seamstress, a school teacher, a postmaster's wife, a woman who ran the laundry on 2nd Street. Women who saw things and wrote them down, Dot said. Or women who lost someone and never believed the explanation they were given. Her finger moved down the list. Clara Hughes lost her younger sister 3 years ago. Girl was 19, answered an advertisement for a teaching position in Albuquerque. Clara was told she ran off with a gambler. Clara never believed it. She looked at Ruth. Clara has the original advertisement, clipped from the Missouri paper, and saved it all this time because she didn't know what else to do with it. Ruth was very still. The advertisement, she said quietly. What paper? The St. Louis Courier, same as yours? The Kansas City Register, Ruth said. But the same format, same language. Something moved behind her eyes that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. They run the same advertisement in multiple papers, rotating the city names so no single paper's editor notices the pattern. Smart, Caleb said, and hated that it was true. Very smart, Ruth said. Vance didn't build this in a year. He's been refining it for a decade at minimum. She straightened. Which means somewhere there is a paper trail going back years. Correspondence, contracts, financial records. The kind of records a man keeps because he believes they protect him. Because on paper, every transaction looks legitimate. Where would those records be? Caleb said. Santa Fe, probably. His main office. Ruth paused. But he also has a local point of contact. Someone who coordinates the actual deliveries, manages the buyer relationships, handles the money on the ground. That person would have records too. Operational records. The kind that don't go back to Santa Fe because they're too specific. Too traceable. Cook, Dot said quietly. The delivery manager at Morrison's. Both of them looked at her. I've been watching him for 6 months, Dot said, with the calm of a woman who has had this conclusion ready and was waiting for the right moment to present it. He receives a letter from Santa Fe every month, not through the post office, through a private courier, a rider who comes in on the Albuquerque road and goes directly to Cook's house on the edge of town. He burns them, but he keeps a ledger of his own. I've seen him writing in it. You've been in his house? Caleb said. I've been in his house, Dot agreed, without elaboration or apology. Caleb looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Caleb. Something passed between them that was not quite amusement and not quite alarm, and was, he realized, the beginning of a working partnership. The ledger, Ruth said. If we can get that ledger and match the entries to the dates and names in your records, Dot, that's evidence. Real evidence. The kind that doesn't rest entirely on our testimony. Getting it is the problem, Caleb said. Cook isn't going to hand it over. No, Ruth said. But Vance is due back in 3 to 4 weeks, according to Dot. When he arrives, Cook will produce that ledger for the quarterly review, which means between now and then, Cook believes he has time. He isn't on alert. He thinks his delivery was completed successfully. She met Caleb's eyes. He doesn't know I'm sitting in your hotel, Dot, drinking tea and reading his ledger entries. He doesn't know yet, Caleb said. Then we move before he finds out. Ruth turned back to Dot. The women on your list, The ones who lost someone, who kept records, who noticed things and wrote them down. Can you bring them together quietly? Not in a group. That attracts attention. One at a time, here or somewhere private. I need to hear every story, collect every piece of paper they kept. Build a complete picture of what Vance has been doing in this territory. I can do that, Dot said. I've been doing the social management of this town for 20 years. I know how to have 5 conversations in a day without anyone thinking they're connected. Good. Ruth stood up. Then that starts today. She looked at Caleb. And you need to find out which way Wade Pickett breaks. How do you suggest I do that? Tell him part of the truth, Ruth said. Not all of it. Enough to see what he does with it. If he goes to Vance, we'll know within 48 hours because Vance will move sooner than expected. If he doesn't, she paused. If he doesn't, then maybe there's something left in Wade Pickett that's been waiting for a reason. Caleb found Pickett at his desk in the sheriff's office at 10 in the morning, working through paperwork with the expression of a man who has taught himself to concentrate on small tasks as a way of not thinking about large ones. He looked up when Caleb walked in, and something shifted in his face. Not guilt, not quite, but the particular alertness of a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation and is not sure whether this is it. Caleb, he said, haven't seen you in a while. Wade. Caleb took the chair across from the desk without being invited. I need to talk to you about the Western Placement Bureau. Every muscle in Wade Pickett's body went still. It was the stillness of a man who has just heard the name of the thing he has been not hearing for 7 years. Not surprise. He knew the name. The stillness was something more complicated than surprise. It was the stillness of a man who is rapidly calculating how much the person across from him already knows. Don't know what that is, Pickett said. Yes, you do. Caleb kept his voice even. No accusation in it. Not yet. A woman was delivered to my property 4 days ago, Wade. Bound. Half-starved. A document pinned to her with my name on it saying she'd been paid for and delivered. He watched Pickett's face. My name. My money. My forged signature. Someone has been using Morrison's store ledger to construct fraudulent purchase records, and someone with regular access to that ledger has been facilitating it. Pickett said nothing. I'm not here to accuse you of anything, Caleb said. I'm here because I think you've been in a bad position for a long time, and I think some part of you has known for a long time that it was going to land somewhere like this. And I think you need to decide right now what kind of man you are when it finally does. The silence in the office stretched out long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then Pickett said, very quietly, The woman. Is she all right? She's alive, Caleb said. She's safe. And she's the most formidable person I have met in 3 years of living very quietly and trying not to get involved in anything. She is going to bring Jerome Vance down, with or without my help, and with or without yours. And the only question any of us has to answer right now is which side of that we want to be standing on when it happens. Pickett put his elbows on the desk and pressed both hands against his face and stayed like that for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. When he dropped his hands, his eyes were the eyes of a man who has just set down something very heavy. He's got Cook running the ground operation, Pickett said. Cook has a ledger. He keeps it at his house, under the floorboard beside the back door. I've never seen inside it, but I know it's there because Vance asked me once, 3 years ago, if I could keep it here in the office. I told him I couldn't. He paused. That's the only time I ever told him no. That took something, Caleb said. Not enough. Pickett looked at him steadily. What do you need from me? Caleb leaned forward. I need you to do your job, he said. For the first time in 7 years, I need you to do exactly what a sheriff is supposed to do. Not for me. Not for some abstract idea of justice. For the women on Vance's list that we haven't found yet, and the ones we still might. Pickett was quiet for a long moment. My boy is 18 now, he said finally. Healthy, strong, studying to be a surveyor over in Albuquerque. He looked at his hands. Vance saved his life, and I've been paying for it ever since, and I am so tired of paying for it. He stood up, and when he stood, he seemed to be standing differently than he had when Caleb walked in. Straighter, heavier in the right way. Tell me what you need. Caleb told him about Cook's ledger, and Wade Pickett listened the way a man listens when he has finally decided, after a very long time, to listen to his own conscience. Cook's ledger was exactly where Pickett said it would be. Wade retrieved it himself the following morning, with a search warrant he'd written out and signed with hands that only shook slightly, citing probable cause related to fraudulent commercial records. Language careful enough to be legally defensible and vague enough not to telegraph what they were actually looking for. He brought it to Dot's office at the back of the mineral house, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, set it on the desk without ceremony, and stood back with his arms folded and the expression of a man who has just crossed a line he cannot uncross, and is still deciding how he feels about that. Ruth opened it. She worked through the pages in silence, her damaged wrists resting on the edge of the desk, her eyes moving with that same rapid precision Caleb had noticed the first time she'd looked at the store ledger entries. Dot stood at her shoulder. Caleb watched from the doorway. Pickett stayed near the window, watching the alley. After 7 minutes, Ruth said, 31 entries, 14 months. She didn't look up. Names, origins, destinations, prices. Cross-referenced with dates of delivery and a notation he uses, the letter C with a circle around it, that I believe indicates confirmed receipt by the buyer. How many confirmed? Dot said. 26. Ruth turned a page. 5 without the confirmation mark, which means 5 women who were delivered, but whose receipt was never confirmed to Cook. She paused. Which means 5 women who potentially never arrived at their intended destination, who are unaccounted for, even within Vance's own system. The room was very quiet. He lost track of 5 of them, Caleb said. Or they escaped, Ruth said. Or something went wrong in transit. Either way, Vance's operation has gaps. Women who fell through the cracks of his bookkeeping. She finally looked up, and her gray eyes were doing something complicated. Anger and grief and a cold, focused calculation, all occupying the same space at once. This ledger is evidence of 31 criminal transactions. With Dot's hotel records and the store ledger pages and the testimonies from Clara Hughes and the other women on Dot's list, we have the beginning of a case that a federal prosecutor cannot easily dismiss. Beginning, Pickett said from the window. Beginning, Ruth confirmed. Vance's lawyers will argue that Cook operated independently, that the Bureau was used by a rogue employee without the principal's knowledge. It's a standard defense for this kind of layered operation. You insulate the man at the top with enough distance that each layer below him takes the fall while he walks. She set her hand flat on the open ledger. We need something that connects Vance directly. His signature, his correspondence, a communication in his own words that demonstrates he knew what was being done in his name. The monthly letters, Dot said. The ones Cook burns. We need one before he burns it. Ruth looked at Caleb. When is the next courier expected? Dot, Caleb said. Dot thought for a moment. 1st of the month, regular as a clock. That's 4 days from now. Then we have 4 days to figure out how to intercept it before it reaches Cook. Ruth closed the ledger and looked at Pickett. Can you hold Cook on the warrant? For the ledger, yes. 48 hours on a commercial fraud charge before I'd need to bring it before Judge Alderman. Pickett's jaw tightened at the judge's name. "And Alderman is one of Vance's regular dinner companions." "Then we don't bring it before Alderman," Ruth said. "Is there a federal circuit judge with jurisdiction over territorial commercial fraud?" "Judge Harold Beaumont, out of Albuquerque," Caleb said. "I dealt with him twice when I was a deputy. He's not in anyone's pocket that I ever found evidence of." "How do we reach him?" "Telegraph," Caleb said. And then he looked at Ruth, and something in the look acknowledged what they both already understood: that the telegraph office in Cowboy Wells was the one place in town where they had no knowledge of whose loyalty it held. Ruth had already thought of this. He could see it in the way she'd set her jaw approximately 3 seconds before he spoke. "I'll go myself," she said. "I'm a certified Western Union operator. If the Cowboy Wells office uses standard equipment, I can send the message directly without going through the local operator. I know the routing codes for the Albuquerque circuit." Pickett turned from the window. "You can do that." "I could do it in my sleep," Ruth said, without any inflection that suggested she was exaggerating. Caleb looked at her. "If Vance has someone watching the telegraph office, then we make sure they're watching something else when I go in." She looked at Dot. "How many people on your list are willing to be visible on short notice?" Dot allowed herself something that was almost a smile. "All of them." The plan they built over the next 2 hours was not elegant. It was the kind of plan that gets built when the people building it have limited resources and considerable necessity, and the specific type of creative problem-solving that comes from having nothing left to lose by trying. Clara Hughes and 4 other women from Dot's list would create a visible gathering on the main street. A charitable committee meeting, ostensibly. The kind of respectable public assembly that happened regularly in small Western towns, and attracted attention precisely because it was entirely unremarkable. Under cover of that distraction, Ruth would enter the telegraph office through the back door, using a key that Dot had held for 12 years in her capacity as the informal keeper of every spare key in Cowboy Wells, and she would send the message to Judge Beaumont directly. Cook they would take that evening. Pickett would serve the warrant personally, with Caleb present as a civilian witness, before Cook had any reason to expect his operation had been compromised. What none of them planned for was that Cook had already been told. They found his house empty. The ledger had come from under the floorboard, but whoever had warned him had done it fast enough that he'd left without taking anything else. His clothes were still in the wardrobe, his breakfast dishes still on the table, the back door standing open onto the alley behind. He had perhaps 2 hours on them, perhaps less. Pickett stood in the empty kitchen and said, very quietly, one word that Caleb had never heard him use before in all the years he'd known him. "Someone talked," Caleb said. "Or someone saw me pull the warrant and put it together." Pickett turned around, and his face had gone the color of old ash. "Alderman. He was in the courthouse this morning when I was writing it up. I didn't think. It was a standard commercial warrant. There was no reason." "Is Alderman connected to Vance directly or through intermediaries?" Ruth said. She had come with them, overriding Caleb's objection with the simple observation that she had as much right to be present for the consequences of their plan as anyone, and that objecting to her presence was the kind of protective instinct she had specifically told him she would not accept. "Directly," Pickett said. "Dinner, cards, correspondence. Alderman has been on the railroad social circuit for 15 years. Then Alderman recognized the connection the moment he saw Cook's name on a warrant and sent word." Ruth was already thinking through the next step. Caleb could see it in her face. The rapid, relentless processing of a mind that had learned in the hardest possible circumstances to adapt quickly. "It means Vance knows something is wrong. He may move his timeline up. If he was planning to arrive in 3 to 4 weeks, he may now arrive sooner. Or he may send men ahead." "How many men does Vance typically travel with?" Caleb asked Dot. "4, when he comes to stay at the hotel. Sometimes 6. Dot's voice was steady, But her hands, he noticed, were pressed flat against the sides of her skirt, in the way people press against things when they need something solid. He presents them as business associates and security staff. They sit in the saloon and play cards, and they are very polite, and they make everyone in town feel faintly afraid without ever doing anything specific to justify that feeling. "We need that message to Beaumont sent today," Ruth said. "Right now, before Vance can get word to whoever manages the telegraph lines between here and Albuquerque." She looked at Caleb. "The distraction plan still works. The timing is just more urgent." Clara Hughes turned out to be a woman of approximately 50, with a permanent grief behind her eyes that she had clearly learned to carry without showing. And when Dot explained what they needed and why, Clara said only, "Tell me where to stand and when." She gathered the other 4 women from Dot's list in under an hour, which told Caleb something about the speed at which women in small towns can organize when they have finally been given a reason. The 5 of them positioned themselves on the main street in front of the dry goods store at 2 in the afternoon, engaged in what appeared to be an animated discussion about the organization of a harvest social. They were loud enough to be noticed, and respectable enough not to be questioned. And the 2 men who had appeared on the street that morning, strangers, in town since just after dawn, spending their time at the window table of the saloon, kept their attention on the gathering with the alert watchfulness of men whose job was to notice things. Ruth went in the back of the telegraph office. She was inside for 11 minutes. Caleb stood in the alley behind the building and counted the minutes against his pulse, and did not look at the back door, because looking at it would not help anything. And he had learned in 3 years of ranching that the most effective thing you can do while waiting for a result you can't control is to focus on what you can control, which in this case was watching the alley entrance and keeping his hand near his Colt. When the door opened and Ruth stepped out, her face told him before she said a word. "It's sent," she said. "Routed through the Albuquerque relay directly to Beaumont's office. I identified myself by certification number so we can verify I'm a legitimate operator. I requested federal intervention on the grounds of interstate trafficking and commercial fraud." She paused. "I also sent a second message." "To who?" "The Western Union District Supervisor in Denver. My original employer, the one whose job offer was used as bait. They have a responsibility to know their employment correspondence is being intercepted and used to lure women into trafficking operations. And they have resources and legal standing that we don't." She looked at him steadily. Vance used Western Union's credibility to make his advertisements believable. I thought it was appropriate to let Western Union know that. Caleb looked at her for a moment. That was smart. "Yes," Ruth said simply, and started walking. They were back at the mineral house when the rider came. He arrived from the south, which was wrong. The Albuquerque road came from the east, and the Santa Fe road from the north, and there was nothing to the south of Cobra Wells for 20 miles except scrubland and a dry creek bed. He rode directly to the hotel and tied his horse at the post and walked inside with the purposeful ease of a man who has been to this particular establishment before and knows its layout. Dot met him in the lobby. He was perhaps 40. Well-dressed in the manner of a man who wants to appear less prosperous than he is, with the particular quality of stillness about him that Caleb associated with men who had learned to make themselves appear harmless. He asked for Dot by name. He smiled with every visible muscle of his face, except his eyes. "Mrs. Crane," he said. "My employer asked me to convey his regards. He understands there's been some confusion about a recent delivery, and he'd like to resolve it amicably before anyone does anything that can't be undone." "Who is your employer?" Dot said. "I believe you know him. He values your hospitality greatly." Dot looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a woman who has been running a hotel for 21 years and has seen every variety of veiled threat delivered with a pleasant face. "I'll need a name," she said. "I extend hospitality to a great many people." Mr. Vance asked me to tell you that he's particularly concerned about the welfare of a woman who was recently misdirected to a property outside of town. He wants to ensure she's being properly cared for, and that any misunderstanding about the nature of her placement has been clarified. She's being cared for, Dot said, by her husband. The smile on the man's face did something small and complicated. Her husband. Married 4 days ago, legal and witnessed. Dot tilted her head slightly. Is there anything else I can help you with? The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mr. Vance will want to speak with the rancher directly. A matter of contract clarification. Mr. Marsh doesn't have a contract with anyone named Vance. There are those who would disagree. There are courts for disagreements, Dot said pleasantly. Was there anything else? He left without another word, and Dot walked back to the office where the rest of them were waiting and closed the door and said, He'll report to Vance within the hour. Vance will move up his arrival. We have less time than we thought. Ruth was already at the desk with Cook's ledger open in front of her and Dot's record spread alongside it, and she looked up when Dot came in and said, How much less? If he rides hard, Vance could be here by tomorrow evening. Ruth looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Pickett. Pickett looked at his hands and then looked up with the expression of a man making a series of rapid decisions about who he intended to be. I can send a rider to Albuquerque, Pickett said. Official communication, sheriff's request for federal assistance. It doubles the paper trail and gives Beaumont a second channel. He paused. I can also contact the territorial marshal's office. They have jurisdiction over Vance's railroad connections in a way I don't.
Do it, Ruth said. Both. The territorial marshal's office means Alderman will know within 24 hours that we've contacted them, Caleb said. Alderman already knows we've done something, Ruth said. The warrant on Cook told him that. Our best protection now is not secrecy. We've already lost secrecy. Our best protection is speed. The more official channels we've activated before Vance arrives, the harder it is for him to make this disappear quietly. She looked around the room at each of them in turn. He came here thinking he could resolve this with a conversation. One smooth, reasonable, well-dressed conversation that would make us understand our position and back away. That is how he has handled every previous complication. Her jaw set. We are not going to be a complication he can smooth. Clara Hughes knocked on the office door at 4 in the afternoon with 2 of the other women behind her, and when Dot let them in, Clara set a small package on the desk without preamble. A packet of letters tied with kitchen string, the envelopes worn soft with handling. My sister's correspondence, she said. Every letter she sent me from the time she left until the letters stopped. The last 3 are postmarked from Albuquerque, which is where she said she was meeting her employer's representative. Her voice was completely flat in the way that grief goes flat after it has been carried for a very long time. Her name was Anna. She was 19 years old, and she could play the piano, and she laughed at her own jokes before she got to the funny part. Clara put her hand on the packet of letters. I want these to matter. I need them to matter. Whatever you're building here, I want Anna's letters in the middle of it. Ruth reached across the desk and put her hand over Clara's, very briefly, and said, They will. The second woman, a seamstress named Frances Dowd, produced a hand-drawn map, her own rendering from memory, of a conversation she had overheard 3 years ago between 2 men she now recognized from Dot's descriptions as Cook's delivery riders. They had stopped at her shop to have a bridle stitched and had talked to each other while they waited, as though she were furniture. She had gone home that night and drawn down everything she remembered, names mentioned, places, a routing description that matched the operational pattern in Cook's ledger with a precision that was almost painful. I didn't know what to do with it, Frances said. I showed it to Wade Pickett. She glanced at Pickett without particular accusation. He said he'd look into it. Pickett said, I put it in a drawer. Yes, Frances said. You did. The silence that followed had the specific quality of a very old wrong being placed on a table where everyone could see it clearly, and Pickett
did not look away from it. "I'm sorry, Francis," he said. "I am genuinely sorry." Francis looked at him for a moment. "Be useful," she said. "That'll do." By the time the sun had started its drop toward the western hills, they had testimony from 4 women, a hand-drawn operational map, 31 documented transactions in Cook's ledger, Dot's 2 years of hotel records, the store ledger pages, and 3 official requests for federal assistance traveling toward Albuquerque by separate routes. Ruth had organized it all into a sequence that built from documentary evidence to eyewitness account to operational detail. The kind of layered evidentiary structure that she explained had been standard in the commercial fraud cases her father had documented in his newspaper before the railroad had taken it from him.
"You've done this before," Caleb said when the others had left, and it was just the 2 of them in Dot's office in the gathering dark. "My father did it," Ruth said. "I watched him. I helped him." She was straightening the last of the papers into the box, her movements precise and economical. "He built a case against the railroad's land scheme in Missouri that was airtight by every standard of commercial journalism. He published it, and within 4 months his paper was gone and he was a broken man." She closed the lid of the box and kept her hands on it. "The difference between what he did and what we're doing is that we are building this for a federal court and not a newspaper. A court can compel testimony. A court can issue warrants. A court can put Jerome Vance in a cell."
"If Beaumont responds in time," Caleb said.
"He'll respond."
Ruth looked up at him, and there was something in her gray eyes that was not quite certainty. She was too honest for false certainty, but was the nearest thing to it that reality would allow. "My message told him enough, and the Western Union supervisor in Denver will apply pressure from a completely different direction the moment he understands what his company's correspondence has been used for." She paused. "Vance has spent years making himself untouchable by controlling the local channels. He has never had to contend with all of the channels activating at once." "Until now," Caleb said. "Until now." She held his gaze. "Tomorrow is going to be very difficult." "I know." "Vance will come in person. He always comes in person when the situation requires personal management. Dot confirmed that pattern. He'll come with his men and his lawyers and the absolute conviction that he can talk his way through this, because he always has before." She picked up the box and held it against her chest. "He is going to see me, and he's going to try to make me feel like cargo again. Like something that was purchased and is owed to him. Like something without standing or voice or rights." Caleb stepped forward and took the box from her. Not because she needed him to carry it, but because it was heavy, and because he could, and because he was standing right there. Their hands touched briefly on the transfer. Neither of them moved away from it for a moment. "He's going to look at you," Caleb said quietly. "And he's going to see a witness who has already set his entire operation in front of a federal judge. Whatever he thinks he sees, that's what's actually there." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You should know something," she said. "I am not a woman who is going to need you to fight this for her. I was not brought up to need that, and I would not accept it if I were." "I know," Caleb said. "But—" She stopped, started again, the way she did when a thought needed more care than usual. "But I have been completely alone for the past several weeks, in a way that I am not able to adequately describe. And the experience of not being alone, the experience of people choosing to stand in the same direction I'm standing, is something I did not expect to feel again this soon." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that I recognize what you've done, and what Dot has done, and what Pickett is doing, and what Clara and Francis and all of them are doing. I want you to know that I am not taking any of it for granted." Caleb looked at the woman in front of him, her ruined dress and her bandaged wrists, and her precise, relentless mind, and the thing underneath all of it that Vance's men had spent days trying to extinguish and had never come close to touching. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we're going to need everything we have." Ruth nodded once, turned toward the door,
Stopped with her hand on the frame and said, without turning back, "Caleb, for what it's worth, I think I chose correctly. This morning, in the church."
He didn't answer right away, because the answer required a moment to be true before he said it. "So did I," he said. She left, and Caleb stood in Dot's office, in the dark, with a box full of evidence, and the particular feeling of a man standing at the edge of a thing that is about to break open. And he thought about Agnes Corbin, and what it would have meant to her to have had this room full of women who noticed, this sheriff who finally turned, this telegraph message already flying down the wire toward a judge who might actually listen. He thought it would have meant everything. Outside, the night settled over Cowboy Wells with a specific desert silence that descends when the wind drops and the animals go still, and the whole landscape seems to hold its breath. Somewhere on the road south of town, a man named Jerome Vance was riding north with his lawyers and his certainty, and no idea what was waiting for him. And in a room at the end of Dot Crane's hall, Ruth Calloway was not sleeping. She was working. He could see the light under her door, building the testimony she would give, arranging the sequence of it in her mind with the same precision she had used to build everything else, preparing for the moment when she would stand in front of the man who had treated her like freight and say, clearly and on the record, exactly what he had done. Vance arrived at noon. Caleb knew he was coming 20 minutes before he rode in, because Dot's network worked faster than any telegraph line in the territory. A word from the woman who ran the laundry, to the woman who kept the boarding house on 2nd Street, to Dot herself, who appeared in the doorway of the Mineral House office where Caleb and Ruth were reviewing the evidence sequence, and said simply, 6 riders, South Road, 20 minutes out. Vance is with them. Ruth set down the paper she was holding, picked up the next one, kept working. "Ruth," Caleb said, "I heard her." She didn't look up. "I need 2 more minutes with this sequence." He gave her the 2 minutes. He stood at the window and watched the south end of the main street and thought about Jerome Vance riding toward a town he had managed for years through the simple mechanism of being the most powerful thing in it. And he thought about what it would look like on Vance's face when he discovered that the mechanism had stopped working. Ruth set the last paper down, aligned it with the others, and closed the box. "All right," she said. Pickett was already on the main street when they came out of the hotel. He was standing in front of his office with his badge catching the noon sun, and his thumbs in his belt, and the particular quality of stillness that Caleb had seen in good lawmen before. The stillness that is not passivity, but the absolute conservation of everything for the moment it becomes necessary. He had sent his deputy to Albuquerque at first light, with the official request for the territorial marshal. The deputy would not be back until tomorrow at the earliest. What Pickett had on the main street of Cowboy Wells right now was himself, his badge, and whatever he had decided he was when he stood up from that desk the day before. Vance rode in at the head of his men with the easy authority of someone who has never had a reason to ride into any place any other way. He was exactly as Dot had described. Well-dressed without ostentation, silver-haired, with the outdoorsman's weathered face and the soft hands and the smile that engaged every muscle except the ones behind the eyes. He rode a good horse and sat it well, and he looked at the main street of Cowboy Wells the way a man looks at something he owns. He saw Pickett first. Something in his expression adjusted, very slightly, very controlled. Then he saw Caleb. Another adjustment, smaller. Then he saw Ruth standing beside Caleb on the steps of the Mineral House, and the adjustments stopped entirely, and his face went still in a way that was more revealing than anything that had moved across it before. He had not expected her to be standing. He had not expected her to be there at all, visible, upright, looking directly at him with gray eyes that held no fear whatsoever. He dismounted and walked toward them with his hands open at his sides, and his smile returned to operational status. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "I believe we have some business to discuss." "We do," Caleb said, "though I'd say it's less between you and me than between you and the federal court system." Vance's smile held. It was, Caleb noted, an exceptionally durable smile. "I'm afraid there's been a significant misunderstanding about the nature of my business operations in this territory. The Western Placement Bureau is a legitimate enterprise. Any irregularities in individual transactions are the responsibility of employees operating outside their sanctioned authority." "Cook," Ruth said. Vance looked at her directly for the first time. Whatever he had expected from the woman his ledger listed as a delivered commodity, it was not this. Not this voice, not this steadiness, not the way she was looking at him, as though she were reading something written on his face and finding it exactly as repellent as she had anticipated. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said, with a graciousness that was so polished it had become its own kind of insult. "My name is Ruth Calloway Marsh," Ruth said. "I was transported from the Albuquerque depot to a property outside this town against my will, in a condition that I am prepared to describe in precise detail before a federal judge. I am a certified Western Union telegraph operator and the daughter of a newspaper editor, and I have spent the past 4 days organizing the documentary evidence of 31 transactions your bureau facilitated in this territory over the past 14 months. She paused for exactly 1 beat. "I know your operation better than you think I do. I know the routing, I know the pricing structure. I know the confirmation notation system your ground man used in his ledger. And I know that 5 of your deliveries were never confirmed, which means there are 5 women unaccounted for in your own records. And I intend to find every one of them." The silence on the main street was the kind that spreads outward, pulling people into it. Caleb was aware without looking that windows were occupied, that the women from Dot's list had positioned themselves at intervals along the street as they had planned, that Clara Hughes was standing in front of the dry goods store with her sister's letters in her hands, and her grief converted into something angular and unyielding. Vance said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to Pickett. "Sheriff, this woman has made some serious allegations against a legitimate business operating under territorial charter. I'll need you to take a statement." "I'll be taking statements," Pickett said, "starting with yours. And I'd ask your men to keep their hands where I can see them." Something shifted in Vance's face. It was subtle, a recalibration, a reassessment, the particular expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting the furniture to be in one arrangement and found it entirely changed. His eyes moved from Pickett to Caleb, to Ruth, and back to Pickett. And in that movement, Caleb could read the calculation happening underneath the smooth surface. Counting, assessing, looking for the weak point. He found it, or thought he did. "Pickett," Vance said, and his voice dropped into something quieter, something that carried the specific weight of a reminder. "I think we both understand that there are obligations between us that make this situation somewhat complex. I'd hate for any confusion to complicate those existing. My son is 18, Pickett said. He's healthy. He's in Albuquerque studying to be a surveyor, and he doesn't know a thing about the loan his father took out when he was 11 years old and dying of fever. He'll never know about it." Pickett looked at Vance steadily. "Because I'm going to make sure that when this is over, the story of what happened here is the one that gets told. And in that story, the loan is settled." Vance stared at him. For the first time, the smile had failed completely. "You understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly what I'm doing." Pickett's voice was the quietest thing on the street, and somehow the loudest. "I'm doing my job. 7 years late, but I'm doing it." One of Vance's men shifted in his saddle. His hand moved toward his hip, and Caleb's Colt was out and leveled before the motion was fully complete and the man's hand stopped. "That would be a mistake," Caleb said. He said it conversationally, which was the right register. The man looked at Vance. Vance looked at Caleb's gun. Then Vance looked at Ruth, and something moved through his eyes that was not quite what it would have been called in a man who felt ordinary things. It was closer to the expression of someone revising an entire strategic framework in real time, recognizing that the ground had shifted so fundamentally that his previous plan was not merely inadequate, but irrelevant. "You've sent for federal authorities," he said to Ruth. "Yesterday," she said. "The ledger?" "Yes." "The store records?" "Those too." He was quiet for a moment. His men were very still on their horses. Behind Vance, Caleb could see Dot Crane standing in the doorway of the mineral house with her arms folded. And beside her, Frances Dowd. And further down the street, 3 other women from the list. All of them visible and still, and watching with the concentrated attention of people who have waited a long time for a thing to finally be seen. "I have lawyers," Vance said. "In Santa Fe and Tucson and Denver."
What you think you have and what will survive contact with my legal representation are 2 very different quantities. "Maybe," Ruth said. "But you should know something about lawyers, Mr. Vance. They work for whoever pays them, and they work best when the case is winnable. When the Western Union District Supervisor in Denver finishes reading the message I sent him yesterday about how your bureau has been using Western Union employment correspondence to identify and lure victims, your lawyers are going to find their relationship with the railroad's legal department becoming considerably more complicated. Western Union has its own lawyers. They are not small." Vance looked at her for a long moment. "You sent a message to Western Union," he said. "I'm a certified operator," Ruth said. "I know the district supervisor personally from my certification process. He will take the message seriously." She held Vance's gaze without any visible effort. "You built this operation on the credibility of legitimate institutions. You used newspaper advertisements and legitimate postal correspondence and the genuine reputations of companies like Western Union to make your fiction believable. The moment those institutions understand they've been used, they become your most motivated adversaries. You don't have enough lawyers for Western Union's legal department and a federal circuit judge simultaneously." Clara Hughes walked across the street. She did it quietly, without drama, with her sister's letters held against her chest and her back straight, and her face carrying 11 years of carefully managed grief. She stopped beside Ruth and looked at Jerome Vance with the expression of a woman who has nothing left to lose because she lost the thing that mattered most a long time ago. "My sister's name was Anna Hughes," she said. "She was 19 years old. She answered one of your advertisements in the St. Louis Courier in the spring of 1871. She wrote me letters from the road that stopped in Albuquerque. I have kept every one of them." She held up the packet. "Her handwriting is on these envelopes, postmarked and dated. The last one says she is meeting a representative of her new employer, and she is a little nervous, but mostly excited." Clara's voice did not shake. It was remarkable how completely it did not shake. "I would like to know what happened to my sister. I would like to know it in a courtroom, on the record, with a judge present. And I would like you to answer that question under oath." Vance said nothing. Frances Dowd stepped forward from the doorway. "My name is Frances Dowd. 3 years ago, 2 men sat in my shop and discussed your routing system while I stitched a bridle. I remember every word." She looked at Vance without flinching. "I wrote it all down that night. It's in the box with everything else." Another woman stepped forward. Then another, each one with a name, a connection,
a piece of the picture. Each one looking at Vance with the specific expression of someone who has been waiting in silence for years and has finally been told that their silence is no longer required. Vance's lead writer made a decision without consulting his employer. He was a practical man, and he was looking at 6 armed women, a sheriff with a badge, a former deputy with a drawn weapon, a ledger that apparently documented 31 crimes in detail, and a telegraph message already traveling toward a federal judge and a corporate legal department simultaneously. He nudged his horse sideways and said quietly to the man beside him, "I'm not dying for a land contractor." The man beside him said nothing. He moved his horse in the same direction. It was, Caleb recognized, the specific moment when the balance shifts, not loudly, not with a single dramatic action, but with the quiet defection of men who have calculated their personal risk and found it no longer proportionate to their loyalty. Vance saw it too. He turned and looked at his riders and understood what their position meant. His face went through several things rapidly, and then it went still in a way that was different from all the previous stillnesses. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his performance, but the genuine stillness of a man confronting something he cannot manage. "What do you want?" he said. He said it to Ruth, not to Caleb, not to Pickett. To Ruth, which was the first honest thing he had done since riding into Cowboy Wells. "I want you in front of a federal judge answering questions about 31 women," Ruth said. "I want Anna Hughes found, and the other 4 women your ledger doesn't account for. I want the Western Placement Bureau dismantled and its records made available to every law enforcement office in every territory where it operated." She paused. "And I want you to understand something before any of that happens." "What?" "You came here this morning believing you could walk into this town and talk your way through this situation, the way you have talked your way through every other situation for the past decade. You believed that because the people you had encountered before were isolated, individual, each one alone with a story that could be dismissed, a grief that could be explained away, a complaint that could be legally managed." Ruth looked at him, and her voice was entirely level. "You didn't know about this room full of women. You didn't know about Dot's records, or Clara's letters, or Francis's map. You didn't know because you never asked. Because you looked at the women you moved through your operation and you saw cargo. And cargo doesn't organize." She held his gaze. "You were wrong about that." Vance looked at the street around him, at the women standing in their positions, at Pickett with his badge, at the box of evidence inside the hotel, at his riders who had made their calculation and were making it clear with every small movement of their bodies. Something moved through his face that was not remorse. It was too late, and he was too thoroughly himself for remorse, but was perhaps the nearest thing to it that his architecture of self-justification would allow. A recognition. A belated, unwilling recognition of the specific thing he had consistently refused to see. "I'll need my lawyers," he said. "You'll have them," Pickett said. "You'll have every legal protection you're entitled to. That's how the law works." He stepped forward. "Jerome Vance, I'm placing you under arrest on charges of commercial fraud, fraudulent use of financial instruments, and unlawful detention, pending federal investigation of additional charges." He said it the way a man says something he has been rehearsing for a long time. Not with theatrical weight, but with the quiet, specific satisfaction of a sentence that is exactly right. "Put your hands where I can see them, please." Vance's men surrendered their weapons without drama. 2 of them had already made it clear they had no interest in dying for a man whose operation had just collapsed in front of a federal telegraph message and a box of organized evidence. And the remaining 4 were reading the room with the practical intelligence of men who understood that the arithmetic had changed. Caleb holstered his Colt. He found Ruth standing a few feet to his right,
watching Pickett walk Vance toward the sheriff's office with the expression of someone watching a thing reach its conclusion that has been unfinished for a long time. Her hands were at her sides. Her back was straight. Whatever she was feeling, and he understood that it was considerable, that the controlled surface covered something that would need space and time and privacy to fully register. She was holding it with the same deliberate precision she had applied to everything else. He moved to stand beside her. "That was your doing," he said quietly. "Most of it." It was everyone's doing. She didn't take her eyes off the receding figures of Vance and Pickett. Clara's letters, Francis's map, Dot's 2 years of watching, your message to Beaumont, Pickett standing up. She paused. It was all of it together. That's the part he never understood. He thought isolated people stay isolated. "They don't," Caleb said. "When someone gives them a reason to find each other." Ruth turned and looked at him. Her gray eyes in the noon light were doing something he hadn't seen in them before. Not softness exactly, not the warmth that takes a long time to earn, but something that was making room for warmth. Something that had decided, on the basis of evidence carefully gathered and carefully weighed, that the room was justified. "There's still the trial," she said. "His lawyers, the territorial judge situation, the 5 unaccounted women." Her voice was practical, deliberate. "This isn't over." "No," Caleb said, "but this part is." Clara Hughes came up beside them. She was still holding her sister's letters. She looked at the sheriff's office door closing behind Vance, and she stood there for a moment, breathing in a way that suggested she had not been breathing completely for 11 years, and was only now remembering how. "Do you think she's alive?" Clara said. Not to either of them specifically, to the air between them. Ruth turned to her. "I think we have more information now than we did yesterday, and I think we are going to spend considerable time and energy acting on it." She met Clara's eyes. "I can't promise you what we'll find, but I can promise you we'll look." Clara nodded once, pressed the letters briefly against her chest. Then she turned and walked back down the street, with the particular walk of a woman who has been holding herself together for a long time, and is now holding herself together for a different reason. Not to prevent collapse, but to carry forward. Dot appeared at Caleb's shoulder, with the silence of a woman who had spent 20 years moving through spaces without drawing attention. "Beaumont's reply came while you were on the street," she said. "Billy wrote it out from the telegraph office 20 minutes ago." She held out a folded paper. "Federal marshals are already en route from Albuquerque. They'll be here by tomorrow morning." Caleb took the paper and read it and handed it to Ruth. Ruth read it and looked up. Something in her face shifted, not surprise, because she had sent the message believing it would work, and she was not a woman who disbelieved in her own judgment. But the particular feeling of a thing you calculated correctly and still find astonishing when it comes true. "He wants full testimony," she said. "All witnesses, all documents. He's issuing an emergency warrant for Vance's records in Santa Fe." "Santa Fe," Caleb said. "The main office. The records going back 10 years. Ruth looked at the paper again. "He wants everything." Dot made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and was not quite a breath, and was entirely satisfied. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'd better make sure the box is organized." Caleb looked at the main street of Cowboy Wells in the full afternoon sun, at the women returning to their ordinary positions, at the horses standing unmanned at the hitching posts, at the sheriff's office where Wade Pickett was doing his job for the first time in 7 years, at the hotel where a box of evidence sat with 31 names in it and 5 more waiting to be found. He looked at Ruth beside him, her bandaged wrists and her absolute precision, and the thing in her gray eyes that was making room for something it hadn't allowed before. "Come inside," she said to him quietly. "We have work to do." And they went inside together, and the work continued. And outside the sun crossed the meridian and began its slow descent, and the day moved forward the way days do when something in them has permanently changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the specific way of things that have finally been set right after a very long time of being wrong.
The federal marshals rode into Cowboy Wells at dawn, 7 of them, led by a deputy marshal named Cross, who had the compact, unhurried manner of a man who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped being impressed by any particular variety of human wrongdoing. He shook Pickett's hand, reviewed the evidence box for 40 minutes without speaking, and then looked up at Ruth and said, "You organized this." "Yes," Ruth said. "You were one of the victims." "I was the first one willing to speak on the record. There are others." Cross looked at her for a moment with the specific assessment of a man deciding how much weight to assign a witness. Whatever he found in her gray eyes satisfied him. "I'll need your full testimony first," he said. "Then the documentary record. Then the additional witnesses." He paused. "Judge Beaumont arrives from Albuquerque in 4 days. He wants to hold preliminary hearings here before the case is transferred to federal court." "Here," Caleb said. "Here, in the Cowboy Wells courthouse." Cross looked at him. "Beaumont's reasoning is that the crimes occurred in this territory and the witnesses are here, and he wants the local population to understand what has been happening in their midst. He believes visibility matters." Cross glanced toward the window and the main street beyond it. "He's not wrong." The 4 days before Beaumont arrived were the most concentrated work Ruth had done since the week her father's newspaper had been printing its final edition before the railroad's lawyers arrived with the foreclosure papers. She gave her testimony to Cross over 2 full days. Not the summarized version, not the version calibrated to what a listener might find comfortable, but the complete and exact account, beginning with the advertisement in the Kansas City Register and ending with the moment she had stepped out the back door of the Cowboy Wells telegraph office with the confirmation that her message had sent. Cross wrote steadily and asked clarifying questions and did not flinch at any of it, which she appreciated more than she said. Clara Hughes gave her testimony on the 3rd day. She sat across from Cross with her sister's letters stacked in chronological order on the table between them, and she spoke for 3 hours without stopping. And when she was done, she looked smaller somehow, and also, in some way that was hard to articulate, lighter, as though the weight of 11 years of unanswered knowing had been transferred from her body to the record, where it belonged. Frances Dowd produced her hand-drawn map and talked Cross through it with the methodical precision of a woman who had been a seamstress for 20 years and understood the value of getting measurements exactly right. The other women from Dot's list added their pieces. A date here, a name there, a description of a man seen in a place he shouldn't have been, a document kept in a drawer because something had said, "Keep this, you may need this," even when no one could say why. Vance's lawyers arrived on the 2nd day from Santa Fe, 3 of them, well-dressed and professionally impassive, who attempted to establish immediately that their client's detention was unlawful and that all evidence collected had been improperly obtained. Cross listened to them with courteous attention and then explained, with the same courteous attention, that the ledger had been obtained under a valid commercial fraud warrant issued by the presiding sheriff, that the telegraph communications were entirely within the sender's professional purview as a certified operator, and that the additional documentary evidence had been voluntarily provided by witnesses exercising their legal right to come forward. The lawyers retired to their hotel room to recalibrate. On the evening of the 3rd day, Caleb found Ruth sitting on the steps of the mineral house in the cooling air, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, her eyes on the street with the look of someone whose mind is somewhere else entirely. He sat down beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while.
My father would have known what to do with all of this, Ruth said finally. He would have written it the right way. Would have made people understand not just the crime, but the conditions that allowed it. The way a territory's dependence on railroad money creates the architecture of silence that men like Vance rely on. She paused. He was better with words than I am. I don't think that's true, Caleb said. She looked at him sideways. You haven't read his work. I've heard yours. In Cross's office for 2 days. He looked at his hands. There were moments in that testimony where I had to remind myself to keep my face neutral. Not from distress, from... He stopped. From the way you described what it was like to understand what was happening and decide to keep gathering information anyway. To turn it into something useful while it was happening to you. He looked at her. That's not something most people can do. Ruth was quiet for a moment. I was scared the entire time, she said. I want to be clear about that. I was not calm. I was not strategic in any way that felt like a choice. I was terrified and I was angry, and the information gathering was the only thing I could do that felt like something rather than nothing. She turned the cold cup in her hands. I keep thinking about the 5 women his ledger didn't account for. The ones with no confirmation mark. I keep thinking that somewhere in this territory, there are 5 women who fell through the gaps of Vance's bookkeeping. And I don't know if that means they escaped, or if it means something worse. Cross is working on it, Caleb said. He's requested Vance's Santa Fe records under the federal warrant. If those women are in the main office correspondence... If, Ruth said. If, he acknowledged. But there's more chance of finding them today than there was a week ago. And more chance next week than today. He looked at her. That's not nothing. She considered this. Then she said, No, it's not nothing. Judge Harold Beaumont arrived on the morning of the 4th day in a covered wagon that suggested either genuine humility or a practical understanding that traveling through New Mexico territory in anything more conspicuous invited trouble. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, with a white beard and the eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for 40 years and had developed a comprehensive immunity to it. He set up in the Cowboy Wells Courthouse, which was a single room attached to the back of the municipal building, and he called the preliminary hearing to order at 10 in the morning, with approximately 40 people crowded inside and another 30 standing at the open windows. Vance's lawyers made their opening arguments for 40 minutes. They were skilled and thorough, and they built the framework of their defense with the practiced efficiency of men who had dismantled cases like this before. Vance as a distant principal, the Bureau as a legitimate enterprise subverted by rogue employees, the evidence as circumstantial and potentially tainted by the emotional distress of unreliable witnesses. Then Beaumont looked at Ruth and said, Mrs. Marsh, you may proceed. Ruth stood up. She had dressed that morning in a clean, dark dress that Dot had found for her, and she had pinned her dark hair back, and she stood in the crowded courthouse with her bandaged wrists visible below her cuffs, and her gray eyes level, and her voice carrying to every corner of the room with the clarity of a woman who had spent years sending precise information down a wire, and understood that precision was not coldness, but was, in fact, the most powerful form of truth. She began with the advertisement. She described the language, the promises, the professional formatting that made it indistinguishable from any legitimate employment posting. She described the train journey, the depot at Albuquerque, the men with a card with her name on it. She described the wagon. She described the ropes. She described the note. She did not spare any of it, and she did not perform any of it. She delivered it the way she delivered everything, exactly as it was, without decoration and without diminishment. And the room received it in the particular silence that descends when a group of people is hearing a thing
they have somehow always known and are only now being permitted to fully understand. Vance's lead lawyer stood up twice to object. Both times, Beaumont looked at him and said, "Overruled," with a patience that suggested he had a limited tolerance for interrupting a witness of this character. When Ruth finished, Clara Hughes stood up without being called. She looked at Beaumont and said, "Your Honor, my name is Clara Hughes, and I have been waiting 11 years to say what I have to say in a room like this one, and I would be grateful for the opportunity." Beaumont looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Hughes, please proceed." Clara's testimony lasted 90 minutes. By the time she sat down, the lawyer who had been objecting had stopped objecting. What happened in the following hours was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes describe legal proceedings. It was methodical and careful, and occasionally technical, and very long. And the weight of it accumulated in the room the way all serious reckonings accumulate. Not in a single moment, but in the layering of one documented truth on top of another, until the structure becomes undeniable. Francis's map, Dot's hotel records, the store ledger pages with their different handwriting, Cook's ledger with its 31 entries and its 5 missing confirmation marks. 3 women who stood up in sequence and gave accounts that corroborated each other across 11 years of separate experience with the same operation. Pickett testified last among the witnesses. He stood in front of Beaumont and the packed room, and he described the loan, the 7 years of deliberate incuriosity, the warrant, the ledger, the morning he had arrested Jerome Vance on the main street of his own town. He did not soften any of it. He described his own failure with the same directness he had applied to the rest of it. And when he was done, he looked at Beaumont and said, "I understand that my conduct over the past 7 years may itself warrant investigation, and I am prepared to cooperate with any such investigation fully." Beaumont looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate that, Sheriff," he said. "We'll address it in due course." He paused. "Your conduct over the past 4 days will also be noted." Vance's lawyers requested a recess for consultation. Beaumont granted 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, Caleb stood in the back of the courthouse and watched Ruth across the room, where she was speaking quietly with Clara Hughes. He could not hear what they were saying. He watched Clara nod slowly, and watched something in her shoulders settle. Not collapse, not surrender, but the settling of a person who has finally been heard in the specific way she needed to be heard. Vance's lead lawyer returned from the consultation with the expression of a man who has spoken to his client and received news about the direction the client wishes to proceed that the lawyer does not endorse. He spoke to Beaumont briefly, in a low voice. Beaumont's expression did not change. Then Beaumont straightened and addressed the room. "This court finds sufficient grounds for federal indictment on all counts presented," he said. "Jerome Vance will be transferred to federal custody and held pending trial in Albuquerque on charges of trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit fraud, fraudulent use of commercial instruments, and unlawful detention. His Santa Fe offices are hereby subject to a federal warrant for all records pertaining to the Western Placement Bureau's operations, dating to its founding." He looked at the room over his glasses. "I am also ordering a federal investigation into the 5 unaccounted cases identified in the operational ledger, to be conducted by Marshall Cross's office in conjunction with Western Union's legal department." He paused. "This is not a conclusion. It is a beginning. The work of finding these women continues, regardless of the outcome of any trial." Vance was led out through the side door by 2 of Cross's marshals. He passed within 10 feet of where Ruth was standing. He did not look at her. She watched him go with the expression of someone watching a thing reach the ending it was always going to reach. And she did not look away until the door had closed behind him. Then she exhaled. One complete breath, out and then in. And in that breath, Caleb heard 3 weeks of held tension releasing. He crossed the room to her. She turned when he was a few feet away and looked at him. And he saw in her face the accumulated weight of everything. The advertisement, the depot, the wagon, the ropes, the note, the 4 days of testimony, the women who had stood up, the ledger with 31 names, the 5 names without confirmation marks that would not let her sleep at night, and probably wouldn't for a long time. All of it present in her face at once, not as defeat, but as the full and specific cost of something that had been worth every cent of it. "It's done," he said. "This part," she said. Same words she had used 3 days ago, and the echo of them was intentional. A reminder that they had agreed from the beginning on an accurate account of where the finish line was. "This part," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I want to go home." And the word home, in her mouth, in that courthouse in Cobra Wells, with the morning light coming through the open windows and the room still full of the people who had stood up. The word home landed on Caleb Marsh in a place he had not expected it to reach. A place he had kept closed for 3 years since Agnes Corbin had died, and he had decided that the safest architecture was one with no interior spaces that mattered. "All right," he said. "Let's go home." They rode north out of Cobra Wells in the late morning, side by side. The same road they had taken that first morning, but different now in every way that counted. The land was exactly as it had always been. Red rock and scrub juniper, and the mountains holding steady in the distance. And it asked nothing of them, and required nothing, and simply received them back into it, the way land receives people who have been away and returned. Neither of them spoke for the first several miles. The silence between them had changed. It had been, in the beginning, the silence of 2 strangers with nothing established between them. Then it had become the silence of 2 people operating under pressure, with no space for anything that wasn't essential. Now it was something else. The silence of 2 people who have been through a thing together and know each other on the other side of it, and are still, somehow, choosing each other's company. They reached the ranch as the afternoon light was beginning to go gold and low. The house sat exactly as Caleb had left it, the fence line running east to west, the windmill turning in the afternoon wind. Ruth reined in her horse and looked at the eastern fence line, where the post stood at the edge of the property. "Right there," she said. "Yes." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the house. Then she looked at Caleb beside her with an expression that was not the expression she had worn when she arrived. Not the controlled blankness of a woman who has decided that survival requires the suspension of all expectation. But something open, something provisional and careful and real. "My father used to say," she said, "that the most dangerous thing a person can do is decide the world is only as good as the worst thing it's done to you." She paused. He said it because he had to decide it for himself every morning after the railroad took his paper. He said it got easier with practice. She looked at the fence post. "I didn't believe him when he said it. I thought it was the thing people say because the alternative is too hard to live with." "And now," Caleb said, "and now I think he was right. And I think it took someone choosing to cut the rope off my wrists and give me water and ask my name before he asked anything else." She turned from the fence and looked at Caleb directly, without the careful management she had applied to everything for so long. "You asked my name, before you asked anything else. Do you remember that?" He did remember. He had asked it because it seemed like the thing that mattered most. Not what had happened to her, not who had done it, but who she was. "I remember," he said. "I have thought about that moment every day since." Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. A man who asks for your name before he asks for your story is a man who understands which one of those things makes you a person. She held his gaze. I did not expect to find that in a wagon in New Mexico territory on the worst morning of my life. But I found it. And I find that I am not willing to pretend I didn't. Caleb Marsh had been a deputy marshal for 11 years and a rancher for 3, and a grieving man for most of both. And he had learned, through all of that experience, that the moments which matter most rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, in the space between one sentence and the next, and you either recognize them or you don't. And the difference between recognizing them and not is everything. He recognized this one. "Ruth," he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to understand that the answer I'm hoping for and the answer I will accept are both your answer, and that nothing changes between us regardless of what you say." She waited. When this is over, the trial, the testimony, the 5 women we haven't found yet, when all of it has been done as thoroughly as we can do it, I would like very much for you to stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because it's practical or convenient or legally simplified, but because this house has been empty in every way that matters for 3 years, and you have been in it for 10 days, and it has not been empty once in those 10 days. He looked at her steadily. I would like you to stay because you want to, and not a minute before. Ruth looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was on her face, and the wind was moving her hair, and she was thinking. He could see her thinking, see the careful, precise mind doing what it did, weighing and assessing and applying the full rigor of its attention to a question that was not, for once, tactical. "The marriage is already legal," she said. "That's not what I'm asking about, and you know it." The corner of her mouth moved. It was small. It was the beginning of something. "I know," she said. I'm saying that it's not the paperwork I need to think about. I'm very clear on the paperwork." She looked at the house, then back at him. "I have not trusted anyone in a considerable amount of time, and I have not had a home since my father's house was sold to pay the railroad's lawyers. And I have not felt safe, genuinely, physically safe, not just analytically safe, but the kind of safe you feel in your body, since I was 19 years old." "And," Caleb said, "and I have felt all 3 of those things here," she said, "in this house, with you." She said it the way she said everything important, plainly, without softening it or decorating it. Just the truth, delivered in its exact shape. That is not a small thing. I am not treating it as a small thing. He reached out, and she put her hand in his, and neither of them made more of it than it was, which was already more than either of them had expected to find again. They sat on the porch that evening as the dark came down and the stars appeared one by one in the New Mexico sky. And they talked about the trial, and about Cross's investigation, and about the 5 women, and about what Dot was planning now that the silence of Cowboy Wells had been permanently broken, and what Clara Hughes intended to do with the energy that had been running nowhere for 11 years, and now had a direction. They talked about Agnes Corbin, and Ruth listened to all of it without the careful management of someone tolerating grief, but with the attention of someone who understood that the dead we carry are not weight we set down, but weight we learn to carry better. And at some point in the talking, the gap between them on the porch bench had closed, in the way gaps close when 2 people stop performing the distance between them and simply sit where they naturally sit. And Ruth's shoulder was against Caleb's arm, and neither of them remarked on it because it required no remark. The weeks that followed were hard and necessary, and full of the specific, unglamorous labor of justice being done properly. depositions and documentary reviews, and Cross's men riding circuits through the territory, following the operational routes in Cook's ledger, turning over rocks that had not been turned over in years. 3 of the 5 unaccounted women were found. One had escaped within days of her initial transport, and had been living under a different name in a small town in Arizona, too frightened to come forward until Cross's men arrived, with the specific and patient reassurance of authority that is actually on your side. One had been placed with a family in California who did not know where she had come from and were genuinely horrified to learn. The third was found through the Western Union investigation, which moved with the speed and resource of a corporation that has discovered its good name has been used without permission and is motivated accordingly. The fourth was not found. The fifth was not found. Ruth did not stop looking for them. She wrote letters. She coordinated with Cross. She worked with the Western Union Legal Department's investigators and with a woman in Santa Fe who had begun a similar effort after the Vance case broke in the territorial papers. The not finding was something she carried the way her father had carried his convictions. Not easily, not without weight, but with the settled determination of someone who has decided that the work matters, regardless of whether the work is ever fully complete. Jerome Vance was convicted in federal court in Albuquerque 4 months later on all primary counts. His lawyers achieved a partial reduction on 2 of the conspiracy charges through a procedural argument that Beaumont allowed over Ruth's written objection. Vance was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. The Western Placement Bureau was dissolved by federal order, its assets seized, and its records transferred to the Marshal's office for ongoing investigation. Judge Alderman resigned his post before charges could be brought, which the territorial papers described as a retirement, and which everyone who had been in that courthouse in Cobry Wells understood as exactly what it was. Wade Pickett was investigated and cleared of criminal complicity on the grounds that his role had been passive rather than active, though the investigation was thorough and the clearing was not without cost to his reputation. He served out his term as sheriff and was not re-elected, which he described to Caleb on the occasion of handing over his badge as a fair outcome. "I did the job wrong for 7 years," he said. "Doing it right for 4 days at the end doesn't cancel the arithmetic. I know that." He paused. "But it matters to me that I did it. I need you to know that it matters to me." "It matters," Caleb said, "to more people than you know." Spring came to the ranch in the way it always does in New Mexico, suddenly, as if the desert had been waiting for permission and someone finally gave it. Things grew in the garden behind the house that Ruth had planted in February, with the methodical optimism of a person who has decided to have a future. The fence line that Caleb rode every morning to check the posts and the wire was the same fence line where the wagon had stood 6 months ago. And every morning when he passed the eastern corner post, he thought about what it had held and what it held now. And the two things were so entirely different that the post itself seemed changed by the comparison. Ruth was at the kitchen table when he came in one morning in April, writing a letter to the woman in Santa Fe who was continuing the search for the 2 unfound women. And she looked up when he came through the door with the look she had developed. The particular look of someone who is genuinely glad to see the specific person who just walked in. The look that does not require announcement because it is simply there, every time, reliable as the morning. He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her, and she told him what she was writing, and he told her what he'd found at the north fence. And they talked about Clara Hughes coming to visit next month, and whether the roof on the back section needed patching before summer. It was an ordinary morning. It was an entirely ordinary morning, and it was the most valuable thing Caleb Marsh had held in 3 years of living alone in a house that had forgotten what it was for. Some rescues happen in a moment. A rope cut, a cup of water, a name asked before anything else. But the deeper rescues happen in all the moments after, in the dailiness of two people choosing the same life and meaning it, in the work that doesn't end, and the faith that the work is worth continuing. Caleb Marsh had ridden out one empty dawn to find a woman left at his fence, like something without value. And in doing so, he had found the only thing that gives any life its full weight. Someone to stand beside, who stands beside you, back. Ruth Calloway had been stripped of everything: her freedom, her safety, her father's legacy, her trust in the world's basic decency. And in the wreckage, she had found what she was actually made of, which turned out to be more than anyone, including herself, had known. They had saved each other in the way that only counts. Not once, not in a single dramatic gesture, but every day, in every small and ordinary choice, to stay. And that was the thing no man with a ledger and a price list would ever be able to buy, sell, or take away.